The coffee was perfect that morning. Steam rose from the white porcelain cup in delicate spirals, carrying the rich aroma of freshly ground beans, mixed with something else, something only I knew about. My weathered hands, steady despite my 87 years, held the cup as I looked directly into Arthur Mendez's eyes. "Here's your coffee, Mr. Arthur." I said, my voice as gentle as always. "Made it just the way you like it." He took the cup without really looking at me, just as he had done every morning for 3 years. If he had looked, really looked, he might have seen something different in my brown eyes that morning. He might have noticed the slight tremor in my hands wasn't from age, but from the weight of what I was about to do. He might have lived another day, but Arthur Mendez had never really seen me. None of them had. To them, I was just the cook, a simple boarding house girl who could barely write her own name. They had no idea that I was about to become their judge, their jury, and their executioner, one carefully measured dose at a time. That was 60 years ago, and not once in all these years have I regretted what I did. Some might call it murder. I call it justice, the only kind available to a 14-year-old girl in 1950s Mississippi who had nowhere else to turn. My name is Geraldine Messiah Quincy, but everyone in Westbrook knows me as Granny D. I'm going to tell you a story I've kept locked away for 6 decades, a story of survival, revenge, and ultimately redemption. It's not a pretty tale, but it's true, and it's time the world knew. In 1952, I was 14 years old and thought I knew what suffering was. I was wrong. Real suffering was waiting for me in Westbrook, Mississippi, disguised as opportunity. Our family lived in Brookhaven, 8 children crammed into a 2-room shack with a dirt floor and a leaking roof. Daddy had died 2 years before from a fever that burned through him like wildfire, leaving Mama to raise us alone. Hunger was our constant companion, not the kind that makes your stomach growl, but the deep, gnawing hunger that makes you dream of food and wake up weaker than when you went to sleep. When Arthur Mendez arrived at our door that September morning, he looked like salvation itself. His black horse was well groomed, his clothes pressed and clean. In our community, where everyone walked barefoot and wore patched clothing, he might as well have been a king. "Mrs. Irene," he said, tipping his hat to Mama, "I hear you have a daughter who's handy in the kitchen." Mama wiped her hands on her apron, the same apron she'd worn for 3 years, now more patches than original fabric. "Yes, sir. My Geraldine here, she's got a gift for cooking. Learned from her grandmother, God rest her soul." Arthur's eyes found me where I stood in the doorway, trying to make myself invisible. "How old are you, child?" "14, sir," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Perfect age to learn proper service." He said, that smile never wavering. "I run a boarding house in Westbrook, the Good Rest. Fine establishment, serves traveling merchants, farmers, sometimes even politicians. I need a girl who can help in the kitchen, someone willing to work hard and learn." He outlined his offer like a preacher promising paradise room and board clean clothes, a small wage, and the thing that made Mama's eyes brighten, the possibility of schooling. "There's a fine school in Westbrook," he continued. "Your daughter could learn to read and write properly, maybe even find herself a good husband someday. Make something of herself." Mama's voice trembled when she spoke. "And the pay, sir?" $5 a month to start, more as she proves herself, plus room, board, and clothing. It's a generous offer, Mrs. Irene. Not many men would take on a girl so young." That night, as I lay on the thin mattress I shared with my 3 sisters, I heard Mama crying softly. She was trying to be quiet, but in a house with walls, that thin privacy was impossible. "It's for the best, Irene," I heard her whisper to herself. "One less mouth to feed, and the girl will have a chance. A real chance." The next morning, I packed my few belongings in a burlap sack, 2 patched dresses, a broken comb, and my most precious possession, a small wooden mortar and pestle that had belonged to my grandmother. It was worn smooth from years of use, and Grandmama had always said it held special power. "This here's been in our family longer than anyone can remember," she told me before she died. It knows the secrets of every herb, every root, every seed. Treat it with respect, and it'll serve you well. I had no idea how prophetic those words would prove to be. The farewell was heartbreaking. My youngest sister Mary, only 3 years old, clung to my legs and wouldn't let go. "Jerry, stay, Jerry, stay!" she cried, her small fists grabbing at my dress. Mama gently pulled her away, tears streaming down her face. "She's going to have a better life, baby. She's going to learn to be a proper lady." My brother Jesse, trying to be the man of the house at 16, shook my hand formally. "You write to us, you hear? Let us know how you're getting on." I promised I would not, knowing that I'd never see any of them again. The journey to Westbrook took 2 days by wagon. Arthur rode alongside on his horse while I sat in the back with supplies and 2 farmhands who barely spoke. The first night we camped by the roadside. I cooked over an open fire beans and cornbread from supplies Arthur had brought. The men complimented my cooking, and I felt a flutter of pride. "You'll do well at the Good Rest," Arthur said, his voice kind in the firelight. "I can always spot a natural cook." If only I'd known that my cooking ability was the least of what he was interested in. We arrived in Westbrook on a Tuesday afternoon. The town was the biggest I'd ever seen, maybe 200 people, with a main street lined with shops, a bank, a doctor's office, and even a small hotel. The Good Rest boarding house sat on a side street, a 2-story wooden building painted a faded blue with white trim. From the outside, it looked respectable enough. A wide porch with rocking chairs, flower boxes in the windows, a sign that read, "Good Rest Boarding House, clean rooms, good meals, Christian environment." Arthur led me inside, and I got my first glimpse of what would be my prison for the next 3 years. The main room served as both lobby and dining area. Mismatched chairs surrounded a long table, and the walls were covered with faded wallpaper that had seen better days. A staircase led to the second floor where the guest rooms were located. "This is where the guests take their meals," Arthur explained. "Breakfast at 7, dinner at noon, supper at 6. No exceptions." He led me to the kitchen, a large room at the back of the house. It had a massive wood-burning stove, a smaller gas stove, and a long preparation table in the center. Shelves lined the walls filled with pots, pans, and dishes. "This is where you'll spend most of your time," Arthur said. "The kitchen is the heart of any boarding house. A good cook can make or break a business." Behind the kitchen was a small room with 3 thin mattresses on the floor. "This is where you'll sleep," Arthur said, "with the other girls." I met them that first evening, Nora, about 20, who had been at the boarding house the longest, Claudia, maybe 30, who handled the laundry, and Claire, close to my age, who helped with everything. They all had the same look eyes that had seen too much, shoulders that carried invisible weight. "You'll get used to it," Nora told me that first night as we lay in the dark. Her voice was flat, emotionless. "First rule, keep your head down and do what you're told. Second rule, don't ask questions about things that ain't your business." "What kind of things?" I asked. The silence stretched so long, I thought she'd fallen asleep. "Then, you'll figure it out soon enough." The work began before dawn. Arthur shook me awake at 4:30, and I stumbled to the kitchen to start the breakfast preparations. Coffee first. Arthur was particular about his coffee. Then biscuits, eggs, bacon when we had it, grits, and whatever else was available. The boarding house typically had 8 to 10 guests at any given time. Traveling salesmen, farmers in town for business, the occasional preacher passing through. They were mostly quiet men who ate their meals, paid their bills, and moved on. But there were 5 men who were different. They didn't just pass through, they belonged to Westbrook, and they treated the Good Rest like their personal club. Arthur Mendez was their leader, a man in his 50s who owned not just the boarding house, but several businesses in town. He was short and stocky, with thinning hair. He tried to hide under a hat and small, pig-like eyes that seemed to see everything. Colonel Justin Whitmore was the most powerful man in 3 counties. He wasn't a real colonel. The title was honorary, but he owned more land than anyone else in the region. Tall and thin, with ice blue eyes and a white mustache, he carried himself like nobility. People stepped aside when he walked down the street. Ambrose Caldwell was a cattle trader built like a bull himself. His hands were permanently stained from handling livestock, and he had a reputation for violence that kept other men wary. He'd killed at least 2 men in fair fights and walked away free both times. Owen Hartwell managed the First National Bank of Westbrook. He was different from the others, educated, well-dressed, married to a prominent family's daughter. He sang in the church choir and coached the local baseball team. In public, he was the picture of respectability. Dr. Isaac Faust was the town's only physician, a widower, who lived in a grand house near the town square. He was the one who delivered babies, set broken bones, and sat with families during their darkest hours. People trusted him with their lives. These 5 men were pillars of the community, respected and feared in equal measure. And once a month, when the moon was full, they gathered at the Good Rest for what they called their gentleman's evening. I learned about their gatherings from Nora, who had been surviving them for 3 years. "They've been doing this since before I got here," she whispered one night. "Arthur started it, said it was just friends getting together to play cards and drink. But it ain't just cards they're interested in." "What do you mean?" I asked, though something in my stomach already knew. Nora's laugh was bitter. "You'll find out soon enough. Arthur's been watching you, saying you're almost ready. Maybe next month, maybe the month after. But it's coming, child. And when it does, you just remember fighting only makes it worse." The first month passed in a blur of work and exhaustion. I was up before dawn and didn't stop until after midnight. My hands became raw from washing dishes, my back ached from bending over the stove, and my feet were covered in blisters from standing on the hard kitchen floor. When I asked Arthur about school, he laughed. "School, girl, you got more important things to learn right here. Cooking, cleaning, serving, that's all the education a girl like you needs." When the end of the month came and I timidly asked about my wages, Arthur's expression turned cold. "Wages? What wages you think room and board is free? You think the clothes on your back don't cost money? You're lucky I'm teaching you a trade. Most girls in your position would be grateful for the opportunity." I tried to protest to remind him of his promises, but he cut me off with a wave of his hand. "If you're not happy here, there's the door. But think carefully, you're a long way from home and you don't have a penny to your name. How exactly do you plan to get back to Brookhaven?" That's when I realized the trap had fully closed around me. I wasn't an employee, I was property. And like all property, I could be used however my owner saw fit. The October moon was full and bright when I experienced my first gentleman's evening. Arthur had been hinting at it for weeks, making comments about how I was filling out nice and learning to be useful. The 5 men arrived after regular supper when the other guests had retired to their rooms. They came through the back door, avoiding the main entrance, and gathered in Arthur's private dining room behind the kitchen. I was serving them their meal, the best food Arthur could afford, with real beef and fresh vegetables, when Colonel Whitmore grabbed my wrist. "Hold on there, sugar," he said, his voice thick with whiskey. "Let me get a good look at you." His grip was firm, his fingers like steel bands around my thin wrist. He turned me around slowly, examining me like livestock at auction. "She's young," he said to Arthur. "How young?" 14. Arthur replied, pouring himself another drink. "Fresh from the country. Barely knows what a man is for." The men laughed, and I felt my face burn with shame and confusion. "Perfect," said Ambrose, his voice a low rumble. "I like them young. They're more pliable." Dr. Faust cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Perhaps we should—" "Should what, Doc?" Owen interrupted, his banker's smile never wavering. "You getting squeamish on us?" I stood frozen, not understanding what was happening, but knowing it was wrong. Something in the air had changed, become charged with a dark electricity that made my skin crawl. "Go back to the kitchen, girl," Arthur said finally. "We'll call you when we need you." I retreated to the kitchen, my heart pounding. Nora was there cleaning the last of the dishes. She took one look at my face and shook her head. "It's starting," she said quietly. "Listen to me careful like. When they call you back in there, you do what they say. Don't fight, don't scream, don't try to run. It only makes them angrier and they'll hurt you worse. I don't understand, I whispered. What do they want? Nora's eyes were infinitely sad. They want to use you, child. Use you up until there ain't nothing left. Same as they done to all of us. From the dining room came the sound of cards being shuffled, glasses clinking, and low masculine laughter. I knew something terrible was coming, but I had no idea how terrible. Around midnight, Arthur called my name. My legs felt like water as I walked back to the dining room. The men were drunk now, their faces flushed, their eyes bright with alcohol, and something else, something hungry. Gentlemen, Arthur announced, standing unsteadily, I present tonight's entertainment. What happened next was the beginning of 3 years of systematic abuse that would have broken most people. They took turns with me, treating me like an object for their pleasure. The details are too horrific to recount in full, but I'll say this, there was nothing human in their treatment of me that night. When it was over, I lay on the floor of Arthur's room, my clothes torn, my body broken, my spirit seemingly shattered. Dr. Faust, the same man who had participated in my violation, knelt beside me and checked my pulse with clinical detachment. She'll be fine, he announced. Young ones heal quick. Arthur nodded. Good, can't have damaged merchandise. They left me there on the floor and returned to their card game as if nothing had happened. I crawled to the kitchen where Nora was waiting with a wet cloth and a cup of willow bark tea. I'm sorry, child, she whispered as she cleaned my wounds. I'm so sorry. The next morning, I had to wake up at 4:30 and prepare breakfast for the same men who had destroyed me the night before. They acted as if nothing had happened, discussing business and politics over their eggs and coffee. Good breakfast, girl, Colonel Whitmore said, not looking at me. Pass the salt. I wanted to scream, to run, to die. Instead, I passed the salt and said, Yes, sir. This became my life. Once a month, when the moon was full, the 5 men would gather for their gentleman's evening. They would drink, eat, play cards, and then use me and the other girls for their pleasure. Between these monthly ordeals, individual men would sometimes visit during the day, demanding special service. Arthur made it clear that resistance was futile. You belong to me, he told me after I tried to fight back during my 3rd month. I bought you from your family, and I can do whatever I want with you. If you don't like it, I can always find other uses for you. The beating that followed that conversation left me bedridden for a week. Dr. Faust treated my injuries with the same clinical detachment he showed everything else. Internal bruising, he told Arthur. No permanent damage, but she'll need time to heal. Time costs money, Arthur replied. Make sure she's ready for next month. I was. The pattern continued for 3 years. I learned to dissociate during the abuse, to let my mind go somewhere else, while my body endured what it had to endure. I learned to anticipate their preferences, to minimize the violence by giving them what they wanted quickly and efficiently. But I never learned to accept it. Somewhere deep inside, a flame of rage burned steadily, growing stronger with each violation, each humiliation, each moment of helplessness. During the day, I was the perfect servant, quiet, obedient, invisible. But at night, lying on my thin mattress, I planned. I dreamed of escape, of revenge, of justice. I just didn't know how to achieve any of it. That changed when I met Miss Janice. Ms. Janice Washington was the closest thing to a saint I've ever met, though she would have laughed at that description. She was a Black woman in her 60s who worked as a washerwoman and healer in the colored section of Westbrook. Despite the racial tensions of 1950s Mississippi, she had earned the respect of both Black and white communities through her skill with herbs and her gentle nature. I first encountered her when Arthur sent me to deliver laundry to her home. It was my 2nd year at the boarding house, and I was 17, though I felt ancient. The monthly abuses had left me hollow, going through the motions of life without truly living. Ms. Janice lived in a small wooden house with the most beautiful garden I'd ever seen. Every inch of her yard was planted with herbs, vegetables, and flowers. The air around her home was thick with the scent of healing plants. "You must be the girl from the Good Rest," she said when I knocked on her door. Her voice was warm, with a slight accent that spoke of education and travels beyond Mississippi. "Yes, ma'am," I replied, keeping my eyes down. "I have your laundry." "Come in, child. Let me get you some lemonade." Her home was small but spotless, filled with drying herbs hanging from the ceiling and shelves lined with jars of mysterious powders and tinctures. It smelled like my grandmother's house, earthy green, alive. "Sit down," she said, gesturing to a chair at her kitchen table. "You look tired." I was tired. Bone-deep, soul-deep tired. But I'd learned not to show weakness, not to complain. "I'm fine, ma'am. Just working hard." Ms. Janice studied me with knowing eyes. "Hard work is one thing, child. But you got the look of someone carrying more than work can put on a person." I started to deny it, but something in her gentle manner broke through my defenses. To my horror, I began to cry, not the quiet, controlled tears I'd learned to shed, but deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from my soul. Ms. Janice didn't ask questions. She simply moved her chair closer and held me while I cried years of pain and rage and hopelessness. When I was finally empty, she handed me a handkerchief and sat back. "Better?" she asked. I nodded, embarrassed by my breakdown. "Don't be ashamed of tears, child. They're the body's way of washing pain out of the heart. Now you want to tell me what's really going on at that boarding house?" I should have kept quiet. I should have made excuses and left. But something about Ms. Janice made me feel safe for the first time in 3 years. "I can't," I whispered. "They'll kill me if I tell." "They'll kill you anyway if you don't do something," she said quietly. "I seen girls like you before, child. Seen how they end up when they got nowhere to turn." Over the next hour, the whole story poured out of me. The false promises, the trap, the monthly abuses, the daily humiliations. Ms. Janice listened without judgment, her face growing darker with each revelation. "Lord have mercy," she said when I finished. "Child, you ain't the first girl they done this to. There been others over the years. Some ran away, some took their own lives, some just disappeared." "What can I do?" I asked. "I got no money, no place to go. They got all the power." Ms. Janice was quiet for a long moment, staring out her window at the garden. "Power," she said finally, "ain't just about money and position. There's other kinds of power, older kinds. My grandmother, she was a slave on a plantation in Louisiana. She couldn't read or write, couldn't own property, couldn't even own herself. But she had power." "What kind of power?" "The power of knowledge. Knowledge of growing things, healing things, and things that ain't for healing." She looked at me intently. "You ever hear of hoodoo, child?" I shook my head. It's old knowledge passed down from Africa through the slave ships to the plantations. Knowledge of herbs and roots, of how to help and how to harm. My grandmother, she used that knowledge to protect herself and others. Sometimes protection means healing. Sometimes it means something else entirely. I felt a chill run down my spine. "You're talking about poison." "I'm talking about justice," Ms. Janice said firmly. "When the law won't protect you, when society turns its back, when powerful men think they can do whatever they want to the powerless, sometimes the only justice is the justice you make yourself." She stood and walked to a shelf lined with jars. "Course, such knowledge is dangerous. Has to be used carefully, precisely. Too much, and you raise suspicions. Too little, and you don't get the results you need." My heart was pounding. "Are you saying—" "I'm saying nothing, child. But I am thinking that a girl who works in a kitchen, who serves food and drink to men who hurt her, such a girl might find this knowledge useful. If she was careful, if she was patient." She pulled a small jar from the shelf. Inside was a fine greenish powder. "This here's from the Jimson weed, devil's trumpet, some call it. Grows wild all over Mississippi, but most folks don't know how to prepare it proper. Used right, it can help with pain, with breathing troubles. Used wrong?" She shrugged. "Well, it can cause all sorts of problems. Confusion, sickness, heart troubles, eventually death." I stared at the jar, my mind racing. How How would someone use it, hypothetically speaking? Miss Janice's eyes twinkled. Well, you'd want to start with very small amounts. A pinch mixed into coffee grounds, maybe. The victim would feel a little off, maybe have some stomach troubles, but nothing serious. Nothing that would raise suspicions. She opened another jar, this one containing dried leaves. This here's foxglove. Beautiful flower, but deadly if you know how to prepare it. Affects the heart, makes it beat irregular. Again, small amounts over time. Patient work. We spent the next 2 hours discussing herbs, their properties, their preparations, their effects. Ms. Janice framed it as general education, teaching me about plants I might encounter. But we both knew what she was really teaching me. As I prepared to leave, she pressed a small cloth bag into my hands. Some herbs for your own use, she said. For healing, you understand. Read the labels carefully and remember knowledge is only as dangerous as the person who wields it. I walked back to the boarding house with my mind spinning. For the first time in 3 years, I felt something besides despair. I felt hope, and with it, a dark purpose. That night, I carefully examined the contents of Ms. Janice's bag. Each herb was labeled with its name and basic properties. Jimson weed, foxglove, oleander castor beans, all deadly in the right quantities, but harmless looking to the untrained eye. I also found a small piece of paper with instructions written in Miss Janice's careful handwriting. Start slow. Build gradual. Watch for patterns. Document everything. Trust no one. Justice is patient work. I memorized the instructions and burned the paper. Then I lay in my thin bed listening to the sounds of the boarding house settling for the night and began to plan. The next morning, I rose before dawn, as always, and began preparing breakfast. But for the first time in 3 years, I smiled as I worked. Arthur noticed. "You're cheerful today," he said suspiciously. "What's got into you?" "Just grateful for the work, sir," I replied, keeping my voice humble. "Grateful for the opportunity to serve." He grunted, satisfied with my answer. If only he'd known that I was grateful. Grateful for the opportunity to serve him exactly what he deserved. The first dose was the hardest. Not because of the technical difficulty Ms. Janice had trained me well, but because of the psychological barrier. Once I crossed that line, there would be no going back. I chose Dr. Faust as my first target. Of all the men, he was the one who occasionally showed flickers of conscience, which somehow made his participation even more disgusting. A man who had sworn to heal, who held the trust of the entire community, who delivered babies and comforted the dying, and who violated teenage girls for sport. It was a Wednesday morning in March, exactly 1 year after my first encounter with Miss Janice. Dr. Faust had come to the boarding house for his weekly breakfast meeting with Arthur. They discussed various business matters the doctor often invested in Arthur's ventures. I prepared his coffee with special care that morning. The Jimson weed powder mixed seamlessly with the coffee grounds, invisible and tasteless. My hands shook slightly as I carried the cup to his table, but I kept my face impassive. "Your coffee, Dr. Faust?" I said, setting the cup in front of him. "Thank you, girl," he replied without looking up from his papers. I watched from the kitchen doorway as he took his first sip, then his second. Nothing happened, of course. The amount I'd used was tiny, barely enough to cause minor discomfort. But it was a beginning. Over the next several weeks, I gradually increased the dosage. Dr. Faust began experiencing digestive problems, nothing serious, just enough to make him uncomfortable. He mentioned it to Arthur once during breakfast. "Stomach's been acting up lately," he said, rubbing his belly. "Getting old, I suppose." Arthur laughed. "That's what you get for eating too much of your own cooking, Doc." If only they'd known that it wasn't his cooking causing the problem, but mine. I kept careful track of everything, the dates, the dosages, the effects. I wrote it all down in a small notebook I hid in the secret compartment of my grandmother's mortar and pestle. The same mortar and pestle I now used to grind the herbs that would be their destruction. After 2 months of gradual poisoning, I began to notice more significant effects. Dr. Faust looked pale and drawn. His hands sometimes trembled when he reached for his coffee cup. His appetite had decreased noticeably. "You feeling all right, Doc?" Owen asked during one of their meetings. "You look a little peaked." "Just tired," Dr. Faust replied, but I could see the worry in his eyes. A doctor who couldn't diagnose his own illness was a frightened man. I continued the slow poisoning for another month. By then, Dr. Faust was seriously ill. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and he'd lost significant weight. He moved slowly, as if every step required tremendous effort. The end came on a Tuesday morning in June. Dr. Faust arrived at the boarding house for his usual breakfast meeting, but he looked terrible. His eyes were sunken, his breathing labored. "Doc, you sure you're all right?" Arthur asked, genuine concern in his voice. "You look like death warmed over." "I'm fine," Dr. Faust insisted, but his voice was weak. "Just need my coffee." I served him his usual cup, but this time I'd added a larger dose of the Jimson weed powder. Not enough to be obviously suspicious, but enough to push his already stressed system over the edge. He took 2 sips of coffee, then set the cup down with a shaking hand. "I don't feel well," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Arthur leaned forward. "What's wrong?" Can't breathe properly," Dr. Faust gasped. His face had turned ashen and sweat beaded on his forehead. He tried to stand, but collapsed back into his chair. His breathing became more labored, and he pressed his hand to his chest. "Heart," he whispered. "Something's wrong with my heart." Arthur jumped up, but it was too late. Dr. Faust's eyes rolled back, and he slumped forward onto the table. His breathing stopped. I stood in the kitchen doorway, watching the scene unfold with carefully composed features. Inside, I felt a mixture of satisfaction and horror. Justice had been served, but I had just watched a man die. Arthur checked for a pulse, then shook his head. "He's gone." The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, brought on by exhaustion and poor health. Dr. Faust had no family to question the diagnosis, and the town's other doctor brought in from the next county saw no reason to investigate further. At the funeral, I stood with the other boarding house staff and listened to the preacher praise Dr. Faust's dedication to healing. The irony wasn't lost on me. The man who had participated in destroying young girls was being celebrated as a healer and pillar of the community. But I knew the truth. Justice had been served one carefully measured dose at a time. That night, I made my first entry in what I privately called my justice ledger. Dr. Isaac Faust died June 15, 1955. Cause heart failure induced by gradual Jimson weed poisoning over 4 months. Justice served. 1 down, 4 to go. I allowed myself a month to plan my next move. During that time, I visited Ms. Janice again, ostensibly to deliver laundry, but actually to report on my progress. "I heard about Dr. Faust," she said quietly as we sat in her kitchen. "Terrible shame. Such a young man." "Yes, ma'am," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. "Very sudden." Ms. Janice studied my face intently. "You look different, child. More peaceful." "I suppose I'm learning to accept my situation," I said carefully. "Acceptance is important," she agreed. "But so is patience. Sometimes the biggest mistakes come from moving too fast." I understood her warning. I couldn't have another member of the group die too soon after Dr. Faust, or suspicions might be raised. I would need to wait to vary my methods to be patient. My next target was Ambrose Caldwell, the cattle trader. He was the most physically powerful of the group, and also the most unpredictable. His violent nature would actually work in my favor. Everyone knew he drank heavily and had a volatile temper. I decided to use a different approach with Ambrose. Instead of the gradual poisoning I'd used on Dr. Faust, I would exploit his alcoholism. Ms. Janice had taught me about certain mushrooms that, when prepared correctly, could cause severe liver damage. Mixed with alcohol, they became even more deadly. Ambrose was easy to target because he came to the boarding house every Friday night to drink and play cards with Arthur. He always brought his own whiskey-expensive stuff he'd acquired through his various business dealings. The interesting thing about Ambrose was that he was already slowly harming his health with alcohol. I would simply help that process along. I began by grinding dried mushrooms into a fine powder using my grandmother's mortar and pestle. The powder was virtually tasteless and mixed easily with whiskey. Every Friday, I would add a small amount to his bottle when he wasn't looking. The effects were more subtle than the Jimson weed poisoning. Ambrose simply seemed to be getting drunk faster, becoming more aggressive, showing signs of what appeared to be advanced alcoholism. Since everyone already knew he was a heavy drinker, no one questioned the deterioration. "Ambrose is really going downhill," Arthur commented to Colonel Whitmore one evening. "Look at him, can barely hold his liquor anymore." Colonel Whitmore nodded. "Man's been drinking too much for too long. Bound to catch up with him eventually." I continued the mushroom poisoning for 6 months, gradually increasing the dosage. Ambrose's health declined steadily. His face became bloated, his eyes yellowed, and his famous strength began to fade. He still came to the monthly gentlemen's evenings, but he was less violent, less energetic than before. The end came during a particularly brutal February snowstorm. Ambrose had been drinking heavily all evening, and the mushroom powder had made him even more intoxicated than usual. He was ranting about some business deal gone wrong, waving his whiskey bottle in the air. "I'll deal with all of them," he declared firmly. "Every single one of those troublemakers." Suddenly, he doubled over in pain, clutching his stomach. "Something's wrong," he gasped. "Feels like my insides are on fire." Colonel Whitmore stood up in alarm. "What's happening to him?" Ambrose began vomiting blood, dark, almost black blood, that indicated severe internal bleeding. He collapsed to his knees, then fell forward onto the floor. "Get the doctor!" Arthur shouted, but we all knew it was too late. Dr. Faust was dead, and the nearest medical help was miles away through the snowstorm. Ambrose Caldwell died on the floor of the Good Rest boarding house, choking on his own blood. The official cause of death was listed as acute liver failure caused by chronic alcoholism. No one questioned it. Everyone knew Ambrose was a heavy drinker. 2 down, 3 to go. I made my second entry in the Justice Ledger. Ambrose Caldwell died February 23, 1956. Caused liver failure induced by mushroom poisoning over 6 months. Justice served. The remaining 3 men were becoming nervous. 2 of their group had died within 8 months of each other, both from apparently natural causes. They began to talk about their own mortality, about the dangers of their lifestyle. "Maybe we should slow down," Owen suggested during one of their meetings. "Take better care of ourselves." Colonel Whitmore laughed, but it sounded forced. "You getting old on us, Owen? A little death never hurt anyone." Arthur wasn't laughing. 2 good men gone in less than a year. Makes a man think. I could see the fear in their eyes, and it filled me with satisfaction. For the first time in their lives, they were experiencing the helplessness that their victims had always known. They were learning what it felt like to be afraid, but I couldn't let them become too suspicious. I needed to vary my methods to space out the deaths to make them seem as natural as possible. My next target was Colonel Whitmore himself. He was the most powerful of the group, the one who had inspired the most fear. He was also the most careful, the most paranoid. This would be my greatest challenge. I spent months studying his habits, his preferences, his weaknesses. Colonel Whitmore was a creature of routine. He arrived at the boarding house at exactly the same time every month, ate the same foods, drank the same whiskey. He was also a hypochondriac, constantly worried about his health. I decided to use his paranoia against him. Instead of direct poisoning, I would make him sick gradually, then offer him a cure that would actually kill him. I began by adding small amounts of various herbs to his food, nothing immediately dangerous, just enough to cause minor but persistent symptoms: stomach discomfort, headaches, occasional dizziness, the kind of vague ailments that would worry a hypochondriac. Colonel Whitmore began complaining about his health during the group's meetings. "I haven't been feeling right lately," he said. "Something's wrong, but I can't put my finger on it." "Maybe you should see a doctor," Arthur suggested. "I would, but our doctor is dead," Colonel Whitmore replied bitterly.
And I don't trust that new fellow they brought in from Hattiesburg.
This was my opening. During one of my visits to Ms. Janice, I asked her about traditional remedies for the symptoms Colonel Whitmore was experiencing.
For stomach troubles and headaches, she mused.
Well, there's several things that might help.
Ginseng root is good for general weakness, willow bark for headaches, and for stomach problems. She paused, thinking. There's a traditional tea made from oleander leaves. Very effective, but you got to be careful with the dosage.
Oleander. I knew that name from my studies. It was one of the most poisonous plants in the world, but in very small amounts it could actually have medicinal properties. The line between medicine and poison was razor thin. I prepared a special tea blend using oleander leaves, along with some genuinely helpful herbs to mask the taste. Then I waited for my opportunity. It came during the next month's gathering. Colonel Whitmore was complaining again about his health, looking genuinely worried.
I feel like I'm wasting away, he said. Every day I'm weaker, sicker. At this rate, I'll be dead within the year. I stepped forward from where I'd been serving drinks. Begging your pardon, Colonel, I said humbly, but I might be able to help.
He looked at me with surprise.
What? My grandmother, she taught me about healing herbs before she passed. I've been watching you, sir, and I think I know what might help.
Colonel Whitmore's eyes lit up with hope.
What kind of herbs? A special tea blend, sir, made from roots and leaves that are good for general weakness and stomach troubles. My grandmother used to make it for folks who had your symptoms. Arthur looked skeptical. You sure about this, girl? I don't want you making the colonel sicker.
Oh, no, sir, I said quickly.
It's very gentle, natural healing like the Lord intended. If it doesn't help, it certainly won't hurt. Colonel Whitmore was desperate enough to try anything. Make me some of this tea, he ordered. I'll try anything at this point. I prepared the tea with great ceremony, making sure the men could see the harmless-looking herbs I was using. I brewed it carefully, testing the temperature and adjusting the flavor with honey.
Here you are, Colonel, I said, presenting the cup with a small curtsy. This should help with your troubles.
Colonel Whitmore took a sip and nodded approvingly. Tastes good, kind of flowery.
He drank the entire cup, and I could see the relief in his eyes. For the first time in months, he looked hopeful.
I feel better already, he said. Girl, you might have saved my life.
If only he'd known that I was about to end it.
Over the next few weeks, Colonel Whitmore requested the tea regularly. He genuinely seemed to be feeling better at first. The placebo effect was powerful. But gradually, as the oleander built up in his system, the real effects began to manifest.
His heart began to beat irregularly. He experienced nausea and confusion. His vision became blurred. But because he trusted the medicine I was giving him, he didn't connect his worsening condition to the tea.
The tea helps, he told Arthur, but I'm still not right. Maybe I need a stronger dose. I was happy to oblige. I increased the amount of oleander in each cup, pushing his system closer to the breaking point. The end came during a thunderstorm in late spring. Colonel Whitmore had just finished his evening tea when he suddenly clutched his chest. My heart, he gasped. It's beating wrong. Too fast then, too slow. Arthur moved toward him, but Colonel Whitmore waved him away. The tea, he whispered. Need more tea. I brought him another cup, this one with a massive dose of oleander. He drank it desperately, as if it were his salvation instead of his doom. Within minutes, he was convulsing. His face turned blue, his breathing became labored, and his heart finally stopped altogether. Colonel Justin Whitmore, one of the most powerful men in 3 counties, died drinking a cup of poisoned tea from the hands of a girl he'd helped abuse for years. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure. No one suspected poisoning after all. The colonel had been drinking medicinal tea to improve his health. The idea that it might have been what killed him never occurred to anyone. 3 down, 2 to go. I made my 3rd entry in the Justice Ledger. Colonel Justin Whitmore died May 17, 1956. Cause heart failure induced by oleander poisoning over 2 months. Justice served.
The deaths of 3 members of their group within 2 years had a profound effect on the remaining men. Arthur and Owen became increasingly paranoid, constantly worried about their own health and mortality.
It's like we're cursed, Owen said during one of their meetings. 3 good men all dead before their time? Arthur nodded grimly. Maybe we should stop meeting, take a break from our activities. But they couldn't stop. The monthly gatherings were too ingrained in their routine, too central to their sense of power and control. They needed to feel dominant, to abuse and humiliate, to prove their superiority over the powerless, which made them perfect targets for my justice. Owen Hartwell was my next target. The bank manager had always been the most deceptive of the group, presenting himself as a respectable family man while participating in the most degrading abuses. His public persona made him particularly despicable. I decided to use his public image against him. Owen was careful about his reputation, terrified of scandal. He would go to great lengths to avoid any behavior that might damage his standing in the community. My plan was to make him paranoid about his health, then exploit that paranoia to deliver the fatal dose. I began by leaving medical pamphlets where Owen would find them information about heart disease, liver problems, the dangers of stress. I also started rumors about various health scares around town, making sure Owen heard about them. Owen was already a nervous man by nature. The deaths of his friends had made him even more anxious. The combination of paranoia and suggestion began to work on his mind. "That I've been having chest pains," he confided to Arthur during one of their meetings. "And my hands shake sometimes. What if I'm having heart problems?" Arthur looked concerned. "You should see a doctor." "I can't," Owen said quickly. "What if word gets out? What if people start asking questions about my health? It could affect my position at the bank." This was exactly the response I'd been hoping for. Owen was so worried about his reputation that he wouldn't seek proper medical care, making him vulnerable to my manipulation. I began adding small amounts of various herbs to Owen's food, nothing immediately dangerous, just enough to cause the symptoms he was already worried about. His hands would shake slightly. His heart would race. He would feel short of breath. Owen became increasingly convinced that he was seriously ill. He started carrying a small bottle of what he thought was heart medication, actually just colored water I'd prepared for him. "I'm dying," he told Arthur one night, his voice shaking. "I can feel it. My body is failing." Arthur tried to reassure him, but Owen was beyond reason. His paranoia had taken complete control of his mind. That's when I made my move. I prepared a special medicine for Owen, a mixture of several deadly plants that would cause heart failure within hours. I presented it to him as a powerful heart tonic that would cure his problems. "This is a very special medicine," I told him privately. "My grandmother got the recipe from a doctor who used it to cure heart problems, but you have to take it all at once and you can't tell anyone about it." Owen was desperate enough to believe anything. He took the bottle of poison and drank it, immediately convinced that it would save his life. Instead, it ended it. Owen Hartwell died at his desk in the bank the next morning, apparently from a heart attack. No one suspected poisoning. After all, Owen had been worried about his heart for months. 4 down, 1 to go. I made my 4th entry in the Justice Ledger. Owen Hartwell died August 3rd, 1956. Cause heart failure induced by mixed plant poisoning. Justice served. Arthur Mendez was the last man standing. He was also the most dangerous because he was starting to become suspicious. The death of 4 of his closest associates had made him paranoid and unpredictable. "It's not natural," he said to me one morning as I served his breakfast. 4 men all dead in less than 2 years. There's something wrong here. I kept my expression neutral. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. Arthur. They were good men." "Were they?" Arthur's eyes were cold, calculating. "Or were they just lucky until their luck ran out?" I could feel the danger in the air. Arthur was beginning to suspect something, even if he couldn't quite put his finger on what. I would have to be more careful with him than with the others. But I would not be deterred. Arthur was the architect of my suffering, the man who had bought me like livestock and allowed his friends to abuse me. He deserved to die more than any of them. The question was how to do it without raising suspicions. Arthur was now hyper-aware of everything he ate and drank. He'd started having other people taste his food before he ate it. He'd even stopped drinking coffee, claiming it was bad for his nerves. I realized I would have to be patient to wait for the perfect opportunity. And I would have to be creative. The opportunity came during a particularly stressful period for Arthur. The boarding house was losing money. The deaths of his wealthy friends had cost him important business connections. He was drinking more heavily and sleeping less. One night, he came to me with a request I hadn't expected. "I want you to prepare something special for me," he said. "Something to help me sleep. I know you've been studying herbs and such. Can you make me a sleeping draft?" I could hardly believe my luck. Arthur was asking me to prepare medicine for him, giving me the perfect opportunity to deliver the final dose of justice. "Of course, Mr. Arthur," I said. "I know just the thing. My grandmother had a recipe for a sleeping tea that worked wonders." I prepared the most potent mixture of deadly plants I'd ever created. Oleander for the heart, Jimson weed for the nerves, foxglove for good measure. I disguised the taste with honey and mint, making it seem like a pleasant, harmless herbal tea. "This will help you sleep like a baby," I told him as I handed him the cup. "Just drink it all down and you'll have the most peaceful sleep of your life." Arthur took the cup suspiciously. "You're sure this is safe?" "Oh, yes, sir. It's exactly what my grandmother used to make. All natural, all safe." He drank the entire cup, then looked at me with something almost like gratitude. "Thank you, girl. You're a good cook. I'm lucky to have you." Lucky. The irony was almost too much to bear. Arthur went to bed that night and never woke up. The massive dose of plant poison stopped his heart within hours. He died peacefully in his sleep, just as I'd promised. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure brought on by stress and alcohol abuse. No one suspected poisoning. After all, Arthur had been drinking an herbal tea to help him sleep. 5 down. Justice served. I made my final entry in the justice ledger. Arthur Mendez died November 12, 1956. Cause heart failure induced by massive plant poisoning. Justice served. With Arthur's death, the boarding house was put up for sale. The new owners had no use for the existing staff, and we were all let go. For the first time in almost 5 years, I was free. I was 19 years old, had no money, no family, and no prospects. But I was alive, and I had delivered justice to the men who had tormented me. That was worth more than any amount of money. Ms. Janice was waiting for me when I knocked on her door the day after Arthur's funeral. She looked older than I remembered, her hair completely white now, but her eyes were still sharp and knowing. "Come in, child," she said, stepping aside to let me enter. "I've been expecting you." Her house was exactly as I remembered, herbs hanging from the ceiling, jars of mysterious powders lining the shelves, the air thick with the scent of growing things. But now, it felt different to me. No longer mysterious and frightening, but welcoming and safe. "I heard about Mr. Arthur," she said as we sat at her kitchen table. "Terrible thing, such a young man." I said nothing, just sat quietly with my hands folded in my lap. Miss Janice studied my face for a long moment. "You look different, child. Older, more settled." "I suppose I am," I replied. "And how do you feel about your education?" I understood what she was really asking. "I feel like I've learned everything I needed to learn." Miss Janice nodded approvingly. "Good, but there's more to learn now, different lessons. How to heal instead of harm, how to build instead of destroy, how to help instead of hurt." "I'd like that," I said, and meant it. The rage that had sustained me for so long was gone, leaving behind an empty space that needed to be filled with something positive. "Then you'll stay here with me," Ms. Janice said. "I'm getting old, and I could use an assistant, someone who understands the power of plants and the responsibility that comes with that knowledge." I spent the next 2 years with Ms. Janice learning the healing arts with the same dedication I'd once applied to the killing arts. She taught me how to prepare medicines, how to diagnose ailments, how to use herbs to help instead of harm. "The same plant that can kill can also heal," she explained as we worked in her garden. "It's all about the dosage, the preparation, the intent. You already know the dark side of this knowledge. Now you need to learn the light side. I learned to prepare teas for coughs and headaches, poultices for wounds, tinctures for various ailments. I learned to read the signs of sickness in people's faces, to understand what their bodies needed to heal. But most importantly, I learned to cook. Ms. Janice was an excellent cook, and she taught me secrets that went beyond mere recipes. She showed me how to prepare food that nourished not just the body, but the soul, how to create meals that brought comfort and joy. Cooking is healing, she said as we prepared a meal for a sick neighbor. When you cook with love, with intention, with the desire to nourish, you're practicing the highest form of medicine. Under her guidance, I transformed from an instrument of revenge into a healer. The same hands that had once ground deadly herbs now prepared medicines that saved lives. The same knowledge that had once been used to kill was now used to heal. When Ms. Janice died peacefully in her sleep in 1959, she left me her house, her garden, and her legacy of healing. But more than that, she left me with a purpose to use my knowledge to help others, particularly women who had suffered as I had suffered. I was 21 years old, and for the first time in my life, I had a clear vision of what I wanted to do with my future. My first job after Miss Janice's death was as a kitchen assistant at the Country Flavor restaurant in downtown Westbrook. It was a small establishment that served simple, hearty food to local workers and travelers. The owner, Mr. Henderson, was a kind man who had known Ms. Janice and respected her recommendation. "Janice said you had a gift for cooking," he told me on my first day. "She also said you'd been through some hard times. Well, we all have our troubles. What matters is how we use them to make ourselves stronger." I started at the bottom, washing dishes, peeling vegetables, cleaning the kitchen. But I watched everything, learned everything, and slowly began to contribute my own ideas to the menu. My first breakthrough came when I suggested adding a special soup to the daily menu. It was based on a recipe Ms. Janice had taught me, but I'd added my own touches, herbs and spices that not only enhanced the flavor, but also provided subtle health benefits. "This is incredible," Mr. Henderson said after tasting it. "I've never had soup like this. What did you put in it?" "Just some herbs and spices," I said modestly. "My grandmother's recipe." The soup became the restaurant's signature dish. People came from miles around just to taste it. Mr. Henderson promoted me to assistant cook, then to head cook within 6 months. I began to develop a reputation in Westbrook as an exceptional cook. People would request specific dishes, and I would create them using the knowledge Ms. Janice had taught me. I learned to read people's faces to understand what their bodies needed and to prepare food that not only satisfied their hunger, but also made them feel better. But my real mission went beyond cooking. I began to notice the women who came to the restaurant, particularly the ones who bore the signs of abuse and suffering I recognized so well. The haunted eyes, the way they flinched when men raised their voices, the careful way they moved as if always expecting violence. I started small. A free meal here, a word of encouragement there. A listening ear for women who needed to talk. I would slip herbal remedies into their food, nothing dangerous, just healing herbs that would help with their pain, their bruises, their broken spirits. Word spread through the underground network of abused women. They began to seek me out, not just for food, but for help. I became a refuge for women who had nowhere else to turn. When Mr. Henderson decided to retire in 1962, he offered to sell me the restaurant. I had been saving every penny living, simply preparing for this moment. With Ms. Janice's legacy and my own savings, I was able to buy the Country Flavor restaurant and rename it Flavors of the Earth. Now I had a platform for my real work. I hired only women, specifically women, who had suffered abuse, neglect, or hardship. I gave them jobs training and, most importantly, hope. My first employee was Sarah, a young woman who had been beaten by her husband and thrown out of her home with nothing but the clothes on her back. She was 22, had 3 small children, and was desperate for work. "I don't know anything about restaurant work," she told me, tears streaming down her face. "But I'll do anything. I'll work for free if I have to." "Nobody works for free here," I told her firmly. and everybody deserves a chance to learn. You'll start as a server, but I'll teach you to cook if you're interested." Sarah was more than interested. She was hungry not just for food, but for knowledge, for skills, for the chance to build a better life for herself and her children. I taught her everything I knew, and she learned quickly. Within a year, Sarah was my assistant manager. Within 2 years, she was ready to open her own restaurant. I helped her get started, providing both financial support and ongoing guidance. Sarah's success became the model for what I wanted to achieve. I began to systematically seek out women who needed help, offering them jobs, training, and the chance to build new lives. Some of them came to me through word of mouth. Others, I found myself women being beaten by their husbands, girls being abused by their fathers, women trapped in cycles of poverty and violence with no way out. I developed a network of safe houses using my restaurant as the hub. Women could come to me for help, and I would provide them with food, shelter, medical care, and job training. Most importantly, I would give them the tools they needed to protect themselves. Not all of my teaching was about cooking. I also taught them about herbs, which ones could heal, which ones could harm, which ones could be used for protection. I showed them how to recognize the signs of danger, how to plan an escape, how to disappear if necessary. And yes, I taught some of them what Ms. Janice had taught me. Not the killing arts, I hoped they would never need those skills, but the knowledge of how to defend themselves, how to fight back, if fighting back was the only option. Knowledge is power, I told them, echoing Miss Janice's words. The more you know, the less helpless you are. By 1970, I had helped over 50 women escape abusive situations and start new lives. Some of them went on to open their own restaurants. Others became teachers, nurses, seamstresses. All of them learned that they were worth more than the men who had tried to destroy them. I also began to expand my business. I opened a second restaurant in a nearby town, then a third. Each new location became a refuge for women in need, a place where they could find safety, support, and the chance to rebuild their lives. My reputation grew throughout Mississippi and beyond. Politicians, celebrities, and business leaders would come to eat at my restaurants, drawn by the exceptional food and the unique atmosphere. They had no idea that they were dining in establishments that served as underground railroads for abused women. But I knew, and that knowledge filled me with a satisfaction deeper than any praise or recognition could provide. In 1975, 20 years after I had delivered justice to the 5 men who had tormented me, I received an unexpected visitor. It was a Tuesday morning, and I was in the kitchen of my main restaurant preparing for the lunch rush when one of my servers approached me nervously. "Ah, Miss Geraldine," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's a man here to see you. He says he's from the county sheriff's office." My blood ran cold. After all these years, had someone finally connected the dots? Had they come to arrest me for the deaths of those 5 men? I wiped my hands on my apron and walked to the front of the restaurant. A tall, thin man in a uniform was standing near the entrance, hat in hand, looking uncomfortable. "Miss Quincy," he said as I approached. "I'm Deputy Sheriff William Ross. I was wondering if I could have a word with you privately." I led him to a corner booth, my mind racing. How much did they know? What evidence had they found? After 20 years of helping other women, was I finally going to pay for my crimes? "What can I do for you, Deputy?" I asked, proud that my voice remained steady. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Well, ma'am, this is a bit awkward. I'm here about my wife." That wasn't what I'd been expecting. "Your wife?" "Yes, ma'am. She's been coming here regularly for the past few months. Almost every day, actually. She orders a meal, sits alone, sometimes talks to your staff. I was wondering if you might know why." I studied his face carefully. He was nervous, but not in the way a man investigating a crime would be. This was personal anxiety, not professional suspicion. "What's your wife's name?" I asked. Margaret Ross. She's about 35, brown hair, usually wears a blue dress." I knew Margaret. She was one of the women I'd been helping, a gentle soul who bore the telltale signs of abuse.
She always sat at the same table, always ordered the same meal, and always left with a small package of herbs I'd prepared for her bruises. "I know your wife," I said carefully. "She's a lovely woman, very quiet, very polite." "She won't tell me why she comes here," Deputy Ross continued. "She just says she likes the food, but I know it's more than that. She's different when she comes home. Calmer, more at peace." This was a delicate situation. I couldn't betray Margaret's confidence, but I also couldn't ignore the pain I could see in her husband's eyes. "Sometimes people need a place where they can just be themselves," I said diplomatically. "Where they don't have to pretend or perform or worry about judgment." Deputy Ross nodded slowly. "I think I understand. I haven't been the best husband lately. Work stress, I've been drinking more, losing my temper more often. I think I've been taking it out on Margaret." He paused, struggling with the words. "I never meant to hurt her. I love her more than life itself. But I've been so angry, so frustrated with everything, and she's been the only one around to take it out on," I finished quietly. He nodded, tears forming in his eyes. "I know it's wrong. I know I'm no better than the men I arrest, but I don't know how to stop. I don't know how to be better." This was a moment of truth. I could have simply advised him to seek help elsewhere, to stay away from his wife, to leave my restaurant, and never come back. But something in his genuine remorse touched me. Deputy Ross," I said, leaning forward slightly. "What would you say if I told you I could help you?" He looked up hopefully. "Help me how?" "Help you control your anger. Help you find better ways to deal with stress. Help you become the husband Margaret deserves." "I'd say yes," he said without hesitation. "I'd say whatever it takes." And so began the most unusual chapter of my work. I started counseling not just abused women, but also some of their abusers' men who genuinely wanted to change, who recognized the damage they were causing, and were willing to work to stop it. Deputy Ross became my first male student. I taught him techniques for managing anger herbs that could help with stress and anxiety, and most importantly, how to recognize the signs that he was about to lose control. I also worked with Margaret, helping her understand that she didn't have to accept abuse, that she deserved better, that she had options. But I also helped her work with her husband to heal their relationship. It took months of work, but eventually, Deputy Ross learned to control his temper. He stopped drinking, started treating Margaret with respect, and became an advocate for domestic violence prevention in the sheriff's department. Word of my work with the Ross family spread, and I began to receive requests from other couples who wanted help healing their relationships. I was careful to only work with men who showed genuine remorse and a real commitment to change, but I found that some abusers could be rehabilitated with the right approach. This work taught me something important. Not all abusers were monsters like the 5 men I'd killed. Some were broken people who had learned unhealthy patterns of behavior and needed help to change. The key was being able to distinguish between those who could be helped and those who were beyond redemption. The men I had poisoned 20 years earlier belonged to the latter category. They had been predators who chose to abuse for their own pleasure, who showed no remorse, who would never have changed. They had deserved the justice I delivered. But men like Deputy Ross, men who were genuinely horrified by their own behavior and desperate to change, they deserved a chance at redemption. By 1980, I had opened 6 restaurants throughout Mississippi, each one serving as both a successful business and a refuge for women in need. I had helped over 200 women escape abusive situations and start new lives. I had counseled dozens of couples, helping them heal their relationships and break cycles of violence. But I was getting older, and I knew I needed to think about the future. I was 42 years old, and while I was still healthy and energetic, I wouldn't be able to do this work forever. That's when I decided to formalize my efforts by establishing the Flavors of the Heart Foundation. It was a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping women escape domestic violence and providing them with the resources they needed to rebuild their lives. The foundation offered shelter, legal aid, job training, childcare, and counseling services.
It also provided education about domestic violence prevention and worked to change laws that protected abusers. I funded the foundation through the profits from my restaurants, but I also began to seek donations from wealthy patrons who believed in the cause. Many of the politicians and celebrities who had eaten at my restaurants were willing to support the foundation once they understood what it was trying to accomplish. The foundation allowed me to help women throughout the entire state of Mississippi, not just in the communities where I had restaurants. We established safe houses, hotlines, and support groups. We worked with law enforcement to improve their response to domestic violence calls. We lobbied for stronger laws to protect victims and prosecute abusers. But the work that gave me the most satisfaction was the mentoring program. I personally worked with young women who had backgrounds similar to mine, girls who had been abused, neglected, or abandoned, who had no hope for the future. I taught them everything I knew: cooking, business management, herbs, and healing self-defense, and most importantly, how to recognize their own worth. I showed them that their past didn't have to define their future, that they could overcome any obstacle with determination and the right support. Many of these young women went on to become successful businesswomen, teachers, nurses, and advocates. Some of them opened their own restaurants, continuing the tradition of using food as a means of healing and empowerment. I called them my heart daughters, and they became the family I'd never had. They visited me regularly, brought their children to meet me, and continued the work I'd started long after they'd moved on to build their own lives. As I approached my 50th birthday in 1988, I realized that I had built something much larger than I'd ever imagined. What had started as a quest for personal revenge had evolved into a movement that had touched thousands of lives. The 5 men who had abused me were long dead, their crimes forgotten by everyone except me. But the work they had inadvertently inspired had created a legacy that would outlive all of us. I had turned my pain into purpose, my suffering into service, my desire for vengeance into a commitment to justice, and in doing so, I had found something I'd never expected: peace. In 1995, 40 years after I had delivered justice to my abusers, I faced the greatest test of my commitment to redemption over revenge. It came in the form of a young woman named Lisa, who arrived at my restaurant on a cold December evening. Lisa was 19 years old, pregnant, and showing signs of severe abuse. Her face was bruised, her lips split, and she moved with the careful precision of someone whose body was hiding multiple injuries. "I need help," she said, simply standing in the doorway of my kitchen. "They told me you help women like me." I immediately brought her to my office, gave her food and medical attention, and began to learn her story. It was depressingly familiar: an abusive boyfriend, a family that had turned their backs on her, nowhere to turn for help. "His name is Tommy Caldwell," she told me as I cleaned her wounds. He's the great-nephew of Ambrose Caldwell, the cattle trader who used to live here." The name hit me like a physical blow. Ambrose Caldwell, one of the 5 men I had killed 40 years earlier. I had assumed that chapter of my life was closed, that the bloodline of my tormentors had died out or moved away. But here was Lisa carrying the child of Ambrose Caldwell's great-nephew, a man who was apparently continuing the family tradition of violence against women. "Tell me about Tommy," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "He's just like his great-uncle was, from what people say. Mean, violent, drinks too much. He beats me when he's drunk, and he beats me when he's sober. He says I'm his property, that he can do whatever he wants to me." The words were like an echo from my past. I could have been listening to myself describe Arthur Mendez and his friends. "How long have you been with him?" I asked. 2 years. I got pregnant 6 months ago, and he got worse after that. Says the baby's probably not even his, that I'm a whore who's been with other men." I felt the familiar rage building in my chest, the same anger that had sustained me through 3 years of abuse and driven me to poison 5 men. But this time, I also felt something else: the wisdom that comes from experience. The understanding that revenge is not the only path to justice. "What do you want to do?" I asked Lisa. "I want to leave him," she said without hesitation. "I want to keep my baby safe. I want to start over somewhere he can't find us. I spent the next several hours making arrangements for Lisa. I contacted one of my safe houses in another state, arranged for transportation, and provided her with money and resources to start a new life. By morning, she was on her way to safety, but I couldn't stop thinking about Tommy Caldwell, the great-nephew of one of my abusers, continuing the family tradition of violence. Every instinct I had told me to track him down to end his reign of terror, the same way I had ended his great-uncle's. I knew I could do it. I still had all the knowledge Ms. Janice had taught me, all the skills I'd developed during my years of revenge. It would be easy to arrange a meeting with Tommy to slip something into his drink to make his death look like an accident. But as I sat in my office that night, staring at the photo of Ms. Janice that hung on my wall, I heard her voice in my memory. Knowledge is only as dangerous as the person who wields it. I had become a different person since those dark days in the 1950s. I had learned to heal instead of harm, to build instead of destroy. Was I willing to throw all of that away for the sake of vengeance against a man I'd never even met? The answer came to me slowly over several days of reflection. I would not kill Tommy Caldwell, but I would stop him. Instead of poison, I used my network. I contacted law enforcement officials I had worked with through the foundation, providing them with information about Tommy's abuse of Lisa. I worked with a private investigator to gather evidence of his other crimes, because men like Tommy were rarely content with one victim. Within 2 months, Tommy Caldwell was arrested on charges of domestic violence assault and drug trafficking. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison. While he was incarcerated, I worked with counselors to provide him with anger management therapy and addiction treatment. When Tommy was released after serving 7 years, he was a changed man. He had learned to control his temper, had overcome his addiction, and had developed genuine remorse for his past actions. He even reached out to Lisa to apologize, though she wisely chose not to respond. Tommy went on to become a counselor himself, working with other men who struggled with violence and addiction. He never knew that I was the one who had orchestrated his arrest, or that I was connected to his great-uncle's death. But he did know that he had been given a second chance at life, and he was determined not to waste it. The Tommy Caldwell case taught me that my greatest victory was not the revenge I had taken on the men who abused me, but the choice I had made to break the cycle of violence instead of perpetuating it. As I sit here today, 87 years old, and reflecting on my long and complicated life, I realize that everything has come full circle. The scared, powerless girl who was abused in a boarding house in the 1950s grew up to become a woman who helped thousands of other women escape similar situations. The hands that once ground deadly herbs now prepare meals that nourish and heal. The knowledge that was once used to kill is now used to save lives. The rage that once consumed me has been transformed into a passion for justice. I've never regretted killing those 5 men. They were monsters who deserved what they got, and their deaths likely saved other girls from suffering as I had suffered. But I'm proud that I learned to fight evil with good, to overcome darkness with light. My restaurants continue to thrive now, managed by my Heart daughters and their children. The Flavors of the Heart Foundation has helped thousands of women escape abusive situations and rebuild their lives. The work continues even as I grow older and less able to participate directly. I've been asked many times if I would do anything differently if I could live my life over again. The answer is no. Every choice I made, every action I took was necessary to bring me to where I am today. The abuse I suffered was terrible, but it gave me the strength and determination to help others who faced similar challenges. The revenge I took was dark, but it was also necessary. In a world where the law failed to protect the innocent, where powerful men could abuse the powerless with impunity, sometimes the only justice is the justice you create yourself. But I'm also grateful that I learned to move beyond revenge, to build something positive from the ashes of my pain. The greatest victory over evil is not to become evil yourself, but to become so good that you transform the very nature of the fight. I have no children of my own, but
but I have hundreds of heart daughters who carry on my work. I have no blood family, but I have a chosen family of women who love me and whom I love in return. I have no regrets, only gratitude for the opportunity to turn my suffering into service. The little girl who was sold into slavery in a boarding house grew up to become a woman who freed hundreds of other women from similar bondage. The teenager who was systematically abused by 5 powerful men became the adult who helped bring justice to countless other victims. This is my story not just of survival, but of transformation. Not just of revenge, but of redemption. Not just of pain, but of purpose. I am Geraldine Messiah Quincy, but you can call me Granny D. I have lived through hell and emerged stronger. I have faced evil and defeated it not just once, but many times over. I have taken the poison that was meant to destroy me and used it to heal others, and I would do it all again. People often ask me for the secret to my success, the recipe for overcoming such overwhelming obstacles. They want to know how a powerless girl from rural Mississippi became a successful businesswoman and advocate for women's rights. The answer is simple. Justice is like cooking. It requires the right ingredients, careful preparation, and patience. You cannot rush it, and you cannot take shortcuts. But if you follow the recipe correctly, the results are satisfying and nourishing. The ingredients for justice are these: courage to face the truth, wisdom to understand the situation, strength to endure the struggle, and compassion to help others who face similar challenges. The preparation requires time. You cannot achieve justice overnight. It takes years of careful work, of building alliances, of learning and growing, of transforming pain into purpose. The patience is perhaps the most important element. Justice delayed is not justice denied if the delay is used to ensure that justice is complete and lasting. Quick revenge may satisfy the immediate desire for vengeance, but true justice creates lasting change. I learned this lesson through my own journey. The revenge I took against my abusers was swift and satisfying, but it was incomplete. It wasn't until I began helping other women that I achieved true justice, not just for myself, but for all the women who had suffered as I had suffered. Today, my restaurants serve more than food. They serve hope. They serve healing. They serve justice to those who have been denied it by the systems that were supposed to protect them. The wooden mortar and pestle that once ground deadly herbs now crushes healing spices. The hands that once delivered poison now prepare nourishing meals. The knowledge that once brought death now brings life. This is the recipe for justice. Take your pain and transform it into purpose. Take your suffering and use it to serve others. Take your anger and channel it into action that makes the world a better place. Cook with love. Season with wisdom. Serve with compassion. And never ever give up. That is the recipe I have followed for 60 years, and it has never failed me. It is the recipe I pass on to all the women who come to me seeking help, seeking hope, seeking justice. Use it well, and you will find that even the darkest ingredients can be transformed into something beautiful, something nourishing, something that heals rather than harms. This is my gift to you. The knowledge that no matter how powerless you feel, no matter how overwhelming your obstacles seem, you have within you the ingredients for justice. You have the ability to transform your pain into purpose, your suffering into service, your desire for revenge into a commitment to making the world better. Cook your justice slowly with patience and wisdom. Season it with compassion and love. Serve it with humility and grace, and always remember that the best revenge is not just a life well lived, but a life that lifts others up from the darkness you once knew. I am Granny D, and this has been my story. May it inspire you to write your own story of triumph over adversity, of justice over oppression, of light over darkness. The recipe is in your hands now. Use it wisely and change the world.